Rachel tightened her grip on the thin boarding pass as she approached the first-class gate at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Her palms were damp, but not from nerves. This was supposed to be a proud moment. For months she had worked double shifts, juggling her full-time job and freelance projects to afford this ticket. It wasn't luxury she craved. It was dignity. She wanted to arrive in Washington, D.C. rested, composed, ready to deliver a speech that mattered. The first-class ticket was her way of ensuring she wouldn't stumble into the ceremony exhausted, her words trembling under the weight of fatigue. The gate agent barely glanced up when Rachel handed over her ticket. With a bored flick of the wrist, the scanner beeped red. The agent frowned, tapped a few keys, and then looked up with that expression Rachel already knew too well, detached, impatient, dismissive. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the agent said flatly. "It seems your seat has been reassigned." Rachel blinked. Reassigned? There must be a mistake. This ticket was purchased months ago. She held it up as if the printed confirmation could speak for itself. The agent sighed, lowering their voice just slightly, but not enough to sound apologetic. "It happens sometimes. Airlines overbook and seating adjustments have to be made. You've been moved to economy." The words hit Rachel like a slap. Economy. She had deliberately chosen this flight, chosen first class, because she couldn't afford mistakes this week. She was headed to speak at a national memorial service for fallen soldiers, men like her father, who had given everything for a flag folded neatly into her family's hands years ago. To arrive flustered and overlooked wasn't an option. "There must be another solution," Rachel said, her voice tight but controlled. "I paid for this seat. I need to be in first class." The gate agent didn't flinch. Instead, they gestured past her, toward the sleekly dressed group of executives waiting nearby. Their polished shoes gleamed against the dull carpet, their conversations clipped and entitled. Without even looking at Rachel, the agent said, "Ma'am, please step aside. Others are waiting to board." Heat rose in Rachel's chest as she turned to look at the men being ushered in. Their laughter was careless, their briefcases expensive, their schedules apparently more important than hers. She wanted to scream, to remind them that respect couldn't be bought with a corporate card, but her throat tightened, sealing the words inside. Passengers behind her shifted uncomfortably, impatient to move forward. One woman muttered, "Just take the seat, sweetheart. It's not the end of the world." Not the end of the world. Rachel bit down hard on her lip. To them, it was a seat. To her, it was the difference between arriving as someone taken seriously or arriving already diminished. Her father used to say that dignity was a soldier's last possession, the one thing no one could strip away unless you allowed them. Right now, she felt that dignity slipping through her fingers. With her shoulders squared, Rachel accepted the crumpled slip of paper that marked her new seat assignment. Row 32, middle seat. She walked the long aisle, past the plush leather chairs of first class, past the curtain that divided the privileged from the ordinary, and into the crowded rows where passengers already fought for overhead space. Every step echoed with humiliation. Sliding into the cramped seat, Rachel tried to steady herself. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and recycled air. Her knees pressed against the seat ahead, and the program for the memorial, folded neatly in her bag, dug into her side as a reminder of why she was here. The boarding door closed with a hollow thud. The executives in first class sipped champagne. Rachel, in row 32, clenched her fists in her lap. The sting of rejection burned hotter than the jet engines outside. She had been her place, not just her seat, but her worth. And though she didn't know it yet, someone else on that plane had noticed. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. Rachel pressed her forehead lightly against the window, watching the tarmac lights blur into streaks. She tried to breathe deeply, but her chest felt tight, as though invisible hands were pressing down. The humiliation at the gate hadn't left her. It lingered, seeping deeper with every passing minute. Row 32 was a world away from the luxury she had once imagined. The seat was narrow, her shoulders squeezed between a man who already claimed the armrest with no intention of sharing, and a restless teenager who bounced his leg incessantly. The hum of chatter and the scent of reheated meals added to the discomfort. Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out the neatly folded memorial program. Her father's name was there, inked carefully among the other fallen soldiers. Seeing it made her throat tight. She traced the letters with her finger, the way she had once traced the creases of the American flag folded at his funeral. That ceremony had been years ago, but the grief had never truly faded. It had only changed shape, becoming a silent companion that walked beside her in moments like this. This flight wasn't just travel, it was a mission. She wasn't attending as a mere guest. She had been invited to speak, to honor men and women who had given everything. She had practiced her speech countless times, whispering it to herself in her tiny apartment, rehearsing the pauses, steadying her voice. She wanted to speak with strength, not just for her father, but for every soldier's family sitting in that audience. But now, crammed into row 32, she felt small, forgotten, overlooked. The flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, handing out water cups. Her gaze slid past Rachel quickly, not unkindly but without recognition. To the crew, she was just another economy passenger, nothing more. No one knew who she was, why she was traveling, or how much weight pressed on her shoulders. Rachel forced a polite smile as the teenager beside her jabbed an elbow into her side, fumbling with earbuds. The man on her other side adjusted his newspaper, taking more space than his seat should have allowed. She wanted to close her eyes, but her mind kept replaying the scene at the gate. The suits slipping into the seats she had paid for, the dismissive look of the agent, the whispers from bystanders who thought she was making too much of it. Her father would have told her to hold her head high. He had always said that dignity wasn't something others gave you, it was something you carried, no matter how the world treated you. But dignity was hard to carry when strangers looked through you like glass. As the engines roared and the plane climbed higher, Rachel wrapped the program back in its protective cover and tucked it carefully away. She sat upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her nails digging into her skin. The weight of unspoken words pressed heavily against her lips. She could stand, she could demand to be heard, but what would it change? She would only be dismissed again. So she swallowed her frustration and chose silence. Yet silence, she realized, was not peace. It was heavy, suffocating, a cloak she had worn too many times before, at work, at the grocery store, in rooms where her presence was tolerated but never valued. She hated that this moment of all moments was another reminder of how invisible she could feel. Still, she forced her body to remain still, her expression calm. The passengers around her would never know that beneath the quiet exterior, her heart pounded with anger and hurt. They would never guess that the young woman in row 32 was on her way to stand before hundreds of people and speak about sacrifice, honor, and courage. And though Rachel didn't realize it yet, her silence wasn't as invisible as she believed. Just across the aisle, a man was watching, the kind of man trained to notice what others overlooked. His eyes were steady, his instincts sharp, and in Rachel's stillness he recognized something more profound than defeat. He saw dignity under siege. And he wasn't the kind to let that go unanswered. The steady thrum of the engines filled the cabin, a white noise that lulled most passengers into distraction. Some flicked through movies on tiny screens, others flipped pages of glossy magazines. But in row 31, just across the aisle from Rachel, a man sat still, so still he seemed carved from the same steel as the plane itself. His name was, though few would recognize it. Officially, he was a retired Navy SEAL. Unofficially, his history was threaded with missions whispered about in military circles but never acknowledged in the public record. His posture gave away hints of that past, upright, alert, yet relaxed in a way only someone trained to control every muscle could manage. Had noticed Rachel the moment she boarded. He had seen the way the gate agent's tone stripped her of dignity, the way executives walked past her without a glance, the way she carried herself down the aisle with quiet resilience. To the untrained eye, she was just another passenger shoved into a middle seat. She was something else, a person carrying weight no one else could see. Now, as the cabin settled into uneasy silence, he studied her out of the corner of his eye. Not staring, just observing. Years of training had taught him to notice details others overlooked. The faint tremor in her fingers when she unfolded a piece of paper. The way her jaw clenched slightly whenever the man beside her hogged more space. The guarded way she tucked something. Was it a program into her bag with reverence, as though it mattered far more than the airline pretzels or boarding pass scattered around her? There was pain there, realized. Not the shallow irritation of a delayed flight, but something deeper, heavier. A sudden jolt of turbulence rocked the plane, rattling trays and startling passengers. Didn't move. His body had long since learned the language of turbulence, of chaos. But he noticed how Rachel instinctively placed her hand over her bag, protecting its contents, as though losing whatever was inside would be more devastating than anything else. When the shaking eased, leaned back, his mind piecing together what he had observed. She wasn't wealthy, her clothes were simple, her shoes worn at the edges. Yet she had bought a first-class ticket. He had overheard the whispers when the passengers boarded. Why spend so much unless it mattered? Why hold on to that folded paper like a lifeline? Something told him her journey wasn't ordinary. An injustice, the kind that stripped people of respect, was something had never learned to ignore. He remembered a mission years ago in Afghanistan, when a young medic was dismissed by senior officers who thought her too inexperienced. She had ended up saving lives when everyone else hesitated. Had never forgotten the look in her eyes when someone finally treated her as an equal. He saw echoes of that same look in Rachel, except here, on this flight, no one seemed willing to give her that respect. Rachel shifted in her seat, pulling her sweater around her shoulders. Her eyes drifted to the executives at the front of the plane, laughing over glasses of wine, followed her gaze. The injustice was sharp, undeniable. He considered speaking to her, offering a word of encouragement, but instinct told him it wasn't the right time. She was holding herself together, barely. Words might undo the fragile armor she had built around her. So waited. He watched. He listened as fragments of conversation floated back from other passengers, the whispers about her being her seat, the speculation that she had been bumped for VIPs. Each snippet confirmed what he had already seen. She had been humiliated, stripped of something she had earned. But more than the whispers, heard something in the silence between them. A story, a mission, a reason she clung to that program like it was sacred. The plane jolted again and this time turned his head fully. Their eyes met briefly, fleetingly. Rachel looked away quickly, embarrassed as though ashamed of being noticed. But in that instant saw it all. The pain, the strength, the quiet dignity struggling to hold. And something inside him settled. This wasn't going to be just another flight. Rachel didn't know it yet but had decided. He wasn't going to let her finish this journey invisible. The sign blinked overhead as the aircraft climbed higher into the night sky. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a constant reminder that they were suspended thousands of feet above the earth. Most passengers had settled into their routines, earbuds in, neck pillows adjusted, plastic cups of soda balancing on trays. But the mood wasn't peaceful. It carried an edge, sharpened by whispers that had begun even before takeoff. Rachel sat stiffly in her seat, eyes fixed on the ahead. The folded memorial program weighed heavily in her bag against her hip, like an anchor pulling her deeper into silence. She tried to disappear into herself, but there was no escaping the cramped quarters, the careless elbows of her neighbors, or the quiet sting of humiliation still simmering inside her chest. Turbulence struck without warning. The plane lurched violently, eliciting gasps and a few nervous laughs. Overhead compartments rattled, and a child squealed somewhere near the back. Rachel's fingers gripped the armrest until her knuckles whitened. She wasn't afraid of flying, she was afraid of breaking. Fear that the tight control she held over her emotions would snap, spilling her vulnerability into a cabin full of strangers who would never understand. Across the aisle, barely moved. His body shifted subtly with the motion of the plane, muscles relaxed yet ready, like a man accustomed to chaos. He didn't look afraid. If anything, the turbulence seemed to sharpen his focus. Years of military deployments had carved that instinct into him. Moments of disruption weren't distractions. They were opportunities to see people as they truly were. And what he saw in Rachel concerned him. Her silence wasn't calm, it was suffocating. She didn't fidget like anxious flyers, nor bury herself in a movie to escape. She sat still, her jaw locked, her chest rising in shallow breaths. The discipline of someone holding something fragile inside. Recognized that look. He had seen it in young soldiers shouldering more than their share of grief, in civilians clutching letters from loved ones who would never come home. The turbulence subsided, but the tension remained. Conversations drifted through the cabin again, lower this time, more subdued. Caught a few of them, passengers murmuring about the woman who got bumped from first class. Some spoke with sympathy, others with thinly veiled judgment, as if she should simply accept her fate. One man muttered, "It's just a seat. Why make a fuss?" Another chuckled, "She doesn't look like first-class material anyway." His jaw tightened. He didn't tolerate disrespect, especially when aimed at someone already carrying invisible weight. His instinct was to shut the talk down, but years of discipline reminded him patience was sometimes the sharper weapon. Instead, he leaned back, listening, gathering the threads of a story that was quickly knitting together in his mind. Rachel, oblivious to the whispers, kept her gaze down. She had learned long ago not to expect fairness, not to expect strangers to see her worth. But saw it, saw the way she clutched her bag whenever turbulence hit, saw the pain flicker in her eyes when the flight attendants drifted past with perfunctory smiles. The executives in first class laughed loudly, the sound carrying through the thin curtain. Glanced toward them, his eyes narrowing. Their privilege had stolen something from her, and they didn't even know it. Or worse, they didn't care. Rachel shifted, pulling her sweater around her shoulders, and for the first time noticed the faint shine of unshed tears in her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, hiding them before anyone else could notice. Anyone else except him. In that small act made a decision. He hadn't planned to intervene. He was off duty, a civilian now, just another traveler. But injustice wasn't something he could watch unfold without stepping in. Not when it involved someone like her, someone carrying the kind of pain that deserved respect, not ridicule. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane leveled out, but inside the pressure was building. He had spent his life fighting battles no one else wanted to fight. Tonight, at 30,000 feet, another battle had found him. And this one wouldn't be fought with weapons. It would be fought with dignity. The cabin had settled into a restless rhythm, faint music leaking from headphones, the clatter of drink carts, the occasional cough breaking through the drone of the engines. But wasn't at rest. His mind, sharp and disciplined, circled the same truth. Injustice had been done, and it was gnawing at him like turbulence that never eased. He glanced once more across the aisle. Rachel sat with her shoulders hunched inward, folded into herself as though she could disappear. She hadn't complained, hadn't spoken up, but could see the toll it was taking on her. Every sigh, every subtle tremor of her hand on the memorial program told him this wasn't about a seat. It was about something bigger, something sacred. A Navy SEAL didn't need orders to recognize when a mission mattered. And right now, his mission was clear. With measured calm, unbuckled his. The faint click of the metal clasp seemed louder than it should have been. A few heads turned, curious, but most passengers stayed absorbed in their screens. He rose slowly, towering above the cramped rows. His movements carried a weight, a steadiness that drew attention without effort. "Sir, please remain seated," a flight attendant said quickly, stepping toward him with a professional smile that didn't quite hide her unease. Looked at her, his eyes steady but not unkind. His voice, when he spoke, was low yet commanding, the kind of tone forged through years of giving orders under fire. "I need to speak with the captain. Open the cockpit door." The words hung in the air like static. A ripple of surprise swept through the passengers. Someone muttered nervously. Another craned their neck to watch. The attendant stiffened. "That's not possible. For security reasons, we can't just." Took a single step forward. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in his tone left no room for argument. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you. Open the door." There was no aggression in him, no wild demand. Just certainty. The kind that comes from a man who had led others through life-and-death moments and emerged alive because people trusted his judgment. His presence filled the narrow aisle, commanding respect without force. Passengers grew quiet. Even the laughter from first class faded as the weight of the moment spread like a shadow. The attendant hesitated, glancing nervously toward her colleague. She didn't know who this man was, but something in his bearing made her pause. This wasn't a drunk traveler or a restless flyer making a scene. This was someone different. Someone who expected compliance because he was used to getting it, for reasons that went beyond personal ego. Rachel's heart thudded against her ribs. She looked up, confusion knitting across her brow. Why was this stranger standing up for her? She wanted to tell him to sit down, to avoid making her humiliation worse, but the words stuck in her throat. There was something in his tone, something in his posture, that silenced her protest before it even formed. The aisle was silent now, all eyes locked on. He didn't falter. He simply waited, calm as stone, until the attendant finally nodded. A was swiped. The heavy latch clicked. The cockpit door opened just a few inches, revealing the puzzled face of the captain inside. "Sir?" the captain asked, his voice cautious, curious. Leaned closer, speaking low but firm, words meant only for the captain yet heavy enough to press into the silence of the cabin. "There's a passenger on this plane who deserves better than what she's been given. She was her seat, her dignity. And she's traveling to honor men and women far greater than the ones sitting up front right now. You need to know this." The captain's brows furrowed, his eyes flicking past to the rows behind him. His gaze lingered on Rachel, still half hidden in row 32, her expression stunned. The cockpit door closed again, but not before the entire cabin had felt it. A shift. The air was charged now, every passenger aware that something larger than a seating dispute had just been set into motion. And for the first time since boarding, Rachel felt something other than humiliation. She felt seen. The cockpit door shut with a solid click, leaving the cabin in thick silence. Passengers leaned into the aisle, whispering nervously. Flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances. For a moment, nothing happened, just the steady hum of the engines carrying them through the night sky. Rachel sat frozen in her seat, her fingers curled around the armrest. Her thoughts spun wildly. Who was this man? Why had he intervened? Her humiliation had already been heavy enough. Now the entire plane was watching. A part of her wanted to sink lower, to disappear completely. But another part, deep inside, stirred with something unfamiliar: hope. The curtain at the front shifted. The cockpit door opened again, wider this time, and the captain stepped out. He was tall, his uniform pressed crisp, his presence authoritative yet approachable. A hush swept through the rows. Pilots rarely left the cockpit mid-flight. The seriousness of it wasn't lost on anyone. The captain looked directly at first. "Sir," he said quietly, "I've heard what you've shared, thank you." Then his gaze shifted, scanning the cabin until it landed on Rachel. His expression softened instantly. "You," he said, his voice carrying clearly though it was calm. "Ma'am, would you mind standing for a moment?" Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Heat flushed her cheeks. "Stand." In front of everyone. She shook her head slightly, her instinct to retreat overwhelming. But's eyes met hers from across the aisle. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, yet the steadiness of his gaze anchored her. With trembling hands, Rachel rose. The cabin seemed to lean toward her. Rows of curious eyes locked on the woman who had been invisible moments before. The captain took the folded program gently from her hand. "Ladies and," he began, his voice deep, resonant, commanding every ear. "I want you to know who this passenger is and why she's flying tonight." He opened the program, holding it with reverence. "Her name is Rachel Morgan. She's on her way to Washington, D.C., not for business, not for leisure, but to speak at a memorial service. Her father's name is listed here, among those who gave their lives in service to this country." A ripple moved through the cabin. Gasps, murmurs. Heads turned sharply toward Rachel. The executives in first class shifted uncomfortably, their laughter silenced, their glasses of wine suddenly heavy in their hands. The captain continued. "She purchased a first-class ticket. She paid for the seat she deserved, but that seat was taken from her. And instead of complaining, instead of demanding attention, she sat quietly, carrying her grief and her purpose alone." He closed the program slowly, his eyes sweeping across the rows. "This is not just about a seat. This is about respect." Rachel's knees trembled beneath her. The attention was overwhelming, but for once, it didn't feel like humiliation. It felt like recognition, something she hadn't expected, something she wasn't sure she even believed she deserved. Remained silent, watching from his place. His mission wasn't to take the spotlight, but to ensure the truth was brought forward. And as he watched the captain speak Rachel's name with dignity, he knew the mission was succeeding. The cabin was utterly still, every passenger hanging on the weight of the captain's words. Then slowly, a smattering of applause began. It started in the back, hesitant, unsure, then spread forward like a wave. Hands came together, louder and louder, until the entire cabin was filled with thunderous clapping. Rachel's eyes blurred with tears, but this time she didn't look away. She stood taller, shoulders squaring, her father's memory burning strong within her. For the first time that day, she didn't feel dismissed or overlooked. She felt seen. The captain handed back the program with care, his expression solemn. "On behalf of this crew and as an American," he said, "thank you for what you're carrying with you. Tonight this plane carries more than passengers, it carries honor." The applause swelled again, echoing through the metal walls, louder than any turbulence, filling the cabin with a new kind of energy. Rachel sank back into her seat, her chest rising with unsteady breaths. She glanced across the aisle, gave her a subtle nod, nothing more, but it was enough. She understood now. He hadn't spoken for himself. He had spoken for her father, for every soldier who couldn't stand in her place. And with that revelation, the flight was no longer just about reaching Washington. It had already arrived somewhere far more meaningful, dignity restored at 30,000 feet. The applause thundered through the cabin, but slowly it began to quiet. What remained was a stillness so profound Rachel could feel it pressing against her chest. For the first time since boarding, she wasn't invisible. Every face turned toward her carried not judgment, not dismissal, but something deeper, respect. Rachel lowered herself back into her seat, her hands trembling as she clutched the memorial program. Her mind reeled. Hours ago, she had walked into the airport certain she would slip through unnoticed, carrying her grief like a private burden. Now, at 30,000 feet, strangers knew her story. Strangers were honoring it. She turned her head slightly, her eyes finding. He wasn't clapping anymore. He simply sat there, steady as ever, giving her that same anchoring look. The message in his gaze was clear. This is your moment. Don't shrink from it. The captain had returned to the cockpit, but the ripple of what he revealed remained, flowing through the cabin like an undercurrent. Finally, a man in row 18 rose slowly, hesitantly. He was older, his back bent but his voice steady. "My brother's name is on that same wall," he said, his words cutting through the hush. "Vietnam, I was just a kid when he left. He never came home." His voice cracked but his chin lifted. "Ma'am, I'm honored to share this flight with you." The silence broke again, not with applause this time, but with murmurs of agreement, passengers nodding, eyes glistening. Then a younger woman near the front spoke up. "My husband's in Afghanistan. He's not home yet. Hearing your story, it gives me strength." Rachel's throat tightened. She wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but emotion choked her words. She looked around, and suddenly it wasn't just her story anymore. It was theirs. People began to share in fragments. A soldier's medal tucked in a wallet. A folded flag resting in a box at home. Names, places, faces of loved ones who had given or were still giving. Each voice was like a thread weaving together a tapestry that bound the cabin into something far greater than strangers on a flight. Rachel wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, then forced herself to stand again. Her knees wobbled, but she steadied them. Her voice shook at first, but she let it rise anyway. "My father believed in service," she said, her words carrying farther than she expected. "He believed in sacrifice, not for recognition, but because it mattered. I came on this flight thinking I would travel alone in silence because grief feels like it doesn't belong anywhere." Her eyes swept across the rows, meeting strangers' gazes one by one. "But tonight I realize we don't carry it alone. We share it, and that makes it bearable." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, as though on cue, passengers began to rise, row by row, seat by seat, standing in silent tribute. Even those in first class, who earlier dismissed her, now stood with solemn faces, their heads bowed slightly. The entire cabin transformed into a living memorial at 30,000 feet. Rachel's chest swelled, her grief no longer a weight pressing her down but a flame lifting her higher. For the first time since her father's passing, she didn't feel like just his daughter left behind. She felt like his voice lived on through her. She sat again, her hands steady now. Across the aisle, finally gave her more than a nod. He gave her the faintest smile, a rare, fleeting thing that told her she had not only been seen but had risen beyond even what he expected. The flight pressed on through the night, but everything had changed. It wasn't just a trip from one city to another. It had become a journey that reshaped hearts, including Rachel's own. And though the engines roared and the world below remained dark, the cabin glowed with a quiet, unshakable light. The rest of the flight passed in a silence that was no longer heavy but reverent. Conversations hushed to whispers. The clinking of glasses and rustle of snack wrappers seemed out of place in the sacred stillness. It wasn't just a commercial flight anymore. It was a vessel carrying memory, honor, and a story that had bound strangers together. Rachel leaned her head against the window, staring into the dark sky. She thought of her father, the way he had laughed when she was a child, the way his voice carried authority but always with kindness. She remembered the crispness of his uniform, the smell of oil and leather, the long nights she had spent waiting for him to come home. He hadn't. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt him close. When the sign chimed on for descent, the atmosphere shifted again. Lights brightened. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings. But there was no return to the usual chatter and bustle. Instead, a quiet expectancy hung over the cabin, as though everyone knew they were about to step off not just a plane, but a shared experience that had changed them. The wheels touched down on the Washington runway with a thud that jolted Rachel back into the moment. The engines roared as the plane slowed, and finally rolled to a steady taxi. Then it happened. Before anyone reached for the overhead bins, before the usual scramble to disembark, stood once more. His broad frame filled the aisle as he turned, facing the passengers. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of command that silenced every rustle and zipper. "Ladies and," he said, "before we leave this plane, I'd like to ask for one thing. Let her go first." He nodded toward Rachel. For a second, Rachel froze, unsure she had heard correctly. But then, slowly, the message rippled through the rows. Heads turned. Eyes met hers. And one by one, passengers sat back, making space, creating an aisle not just of convenience but of honor. Rachel's chest tightened. Her instinct was to refuse, to shrink from the spotlight, but something inside her had changed during this flight. She no longer carried shame. She carried her father's memory, her own strength, and the voices of everyone who had stood with her. With shaky legs, she rose, stepped back, allowing her to pass. As she walked down the aisle, passengers straightened, many placing their hands over their hearts. Some whispered words of thanks. Others simply nodded with solemn respect. The gesture was small, but in its simplicity it was profound. Rachel's throat burned with emotion. She reached the front of the plane, the first-class cabin silent as its well-dressed passengers looked up at her with faces stripped of smugness. A few lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others clapped softly, respectfully. The flight attendants, who earlier had only offered polite indifference, now stood, their expressions reverent. One whispered, "We're sorry," as Rachel passed. The cockpit door opened again, and the captain stepped out once more. He didn't speak this time. He simply raised his hand to his forehead in a crisp salute. Rachel halted, stunned. For a heartbeat, her world narrowed to that single gesture. Her father had saluted like that. She had seen it 1,000 times, and now here it was again, offered to her. Tears spilled freely as she returned the salute, her hand trembling but steady enough to complete it. The captain lowered his hand, his eyes glistening, then nodded for her to disembark. Rachel stepped into the jet bridge, her breath shaky but strong. She felt taller somehow, lighter, as though she carried not just her grief but also the strength of everyone who had witnessed her story. Behind her, passengers began to file out, their chatter subdued. Many would never forget the night they flew with Rachel Morgan. The night a Navy SEAL stood for justice. The night a plane became a memorial in the sky. As she entered the terminal, the bustle of DC greeted her, the clatter of wheels on tile, the hum of announcements. But none of it pierced the cocoon of peace surrounding her. She walked forward with steady steps, her father's spirit alive in every stride. Rachel Morgan had boarded the flight as just another passenger. She left it as something else entirely, a voice that carried the weight of memory, dignity, and a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, like seat 32B of a crowded plane, extraordinary things can happen.